30 days prior to the study. Okay, so research has shown that dual tasking does decrease many spatial temporal aspects of gait, and so for the purpose of this study, we're going to control for that by having a participant sing in childhood nursery rhyme that they should be familiar with. That's why it's part of the inclusion criteria, and that will be really your vote. So that way they don't have to put a lot of cognitive attention towards getting the rhythm of the song right, knowing the words, and they can kind of devote all of that attention to the walking tasks in the study.
So after demographic information is collected, participants will then complete 3 surveys. The first 2 surveys will be the BDI and the MMSE. The BDI is going to be for, you must score less than an 18, and this will help us see symptoms of major depression that may affect spatial temporal patterns of gait. The second one is MMSE. This tests for problems associated with memory or other cognitive related issues. The scoring, they must have scored greater than 24. And symptoms of dementia may also affect the spatial temporal gait. And the first 2 surveys will be for all healthy older adults, healthy younger adults, and persons with Parkinson's disease. The PD-239 is for persons with Parkinson's disease. It's a 39 questionnaire that assesses Parkinson's disease specific related quality over the last month, evaluating how persons impacted by Parkinson's will help us analyze our results.
After all of our questionnaires are completed, we will then begin testing muscular activity, which we will use EMG sensors to detect. We'll be testing mainly the lower extremities, primarily one of the important ones we'll be testing is on the gastrocnemius which is shown in the picture right there. We will use motion monitor software that will help us filter and amplify our signals accordingly. We will also be testing spatiotemporal patterns where we will use focal body sensors and we place them on the body as shown in the picture. One will be on the chest, one will be on the lower back, 2 will be on the wrist, and 2 will be on the feet. Those will be used to test cadence, gait speed, stride length, and sway. Okay, so going into the methodology of our walking tests. So when we are actually performing this experiment, we're going to randomize the conditions, but for a nice presentation sake, we're going to present them in a certain order. So the first test will be overground walking, which is just walking forward normally at approximately, we're going to have to take about 4 meters. And the first condition will be just walking at the preferred pace with no auditory cues, meaning no singing, just walking normally. And we'll do that 3 times. And then the second condition will be overground walking again at the preferred pace, except this time we'll be singing row, 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 row. Then for our complex walking task, we will have them perform a certain like movement. We will set up some cones in approximately a span of 4 meters. There will be 3 tiles that will be run for each condition. The first condition will be preferred pace with no auditory cues, no singing. And the second condition would be them with their preferred pace walking around the cones with the self-produced auditory cues. Our results are expected that the auditory cues will help improve a person's gait while they are performing the complex walking task. It is also expected that singing while completing complex walking tasks will improve normal muscular abnormalities and inequalities. And specifically, we expect that singing while performing the complex walking tasks will improve one's posture, cadence, gait speed, stride length, and sway. So our current stage during all of this is we are waiting for our IRD to be approved. It has been submitted, and once that is approved, we'll begin collecting data on healthy young adults, and then we'll move on to healthy older adults, and then hopefully eventually Parkinson's. And we just want to give a thank you to our professor, Dr. Elizabeth Sedgemore, and our graduate student, Cassandra Diaz, who helped us develop throughout the whole project. And we want to say thank you to our lab and students in our lab and all these participants for being our motivation.
All right, thank you. Questions from the audience? Don't be shy.
Hello. So this is obviously projecting because you haven't done a study yet, but is there one of your gait variables that you think is going to be affected the most by the complex tasks?
I think the overground would be affected the most because that kind of
aligns more to the beat of the song versus like going in a serpentine movement. But I think the goal is to just see improvement. And overall, we know that studies have shown overground walking has been improved by mental singing and singing. So, but there hasn't been studies looking at the complex movements of serpentine movements or walking backwards or all various other complex walking tasks. But I think that since there's already been studies that have shown overground walking and that reversing flexibility, that might show more improvement in the complex walking, but we're still hoping and think we will see some improvement with the
Other questions? I've got a question. You're planning to take electromyography. Do you have any expectations for what you might see for changes? In this case, you're looking at activation of the gas drive.
Right, yeah. So I think we're expecting to see lower amplitude first, and like there was a study that also was done in the past that was similar to this, and it was looking at music experience on walking, and they did find in their electromyography data that it was evening out the more affected side of people with Parkinson's disease. It was more symmetrical and follow their amplitude first.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you've got control, you've got like healthy.
Right,
You become more like them. You're the first or the loss, that's okay. I would guess if you're more like shuffling, you may have more of a constant rather than a very
Right.
distinct pattern.
yes.
So, yeah, be very interesting. Any other questions for Mr. Al?
Thanks,
Nice
guys.
job, and best of luck going forward. Very
Thank
interesting
you.
stuff.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
All right, I wanted to ask, any representatives who are subject to here, the auditory cues, and variability differential?
They're not.
Okay.
Anything around community there, you still, we're very around the presentation, so it's online.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't see one cursor. Do you see that? Okay, now section 4.
Yeah, they made hands.
Hello, we are from Dr. Stegermuller's Neurophysiology Lab, and we are presenting on the effects of auditory cues on variability in handwriting. I am Jamie Helbert. I'm Julia Hansen. And I'm Nicole Latimer. Literature has shown that auditory cues have been found to reduce variability in fine motor tasks. And these different auditory cues have been shown to have different effects on gross motor tasks, such as activating music and gait speed. In a previous study, participants were asked to draw circles in time with a pacing tone that was presented at either 1.25 hertz or 1.5 hertz, and it showed that auditory cues lowered variability in cycle time and amplitude in people with Parkinson's disease. The American Parkinson's Disease Association suggests various pens, pencils, and writing devices that are available to stabilize grip, and weighted pens may help reduce tremors and improve handwriting for those with Parkinson's disease. However, there is limited research over weighted pens and auditory cues effectiveness on handwriting. So we aim to determine how auditory cues affected variability in fine motor tasks, such as handwriting. And we hypothesized that the presence of auditory cues would decrease the amount of variability in handwriting compared to a condition with no auditory cues. We also hypothesized that peak-to-peak time during handwriting would improve across auditory cue conditions. And we also thought that the use of a weighted pen would decrease variability in peak acceleration and movement time when compared to writing with a standard ballpoint pen with auditory cues. These are participant demographics. We did have a small selection size of 8 participants. Their average age was 72. We did have a 62% female population, and due to our collection setup, they were all right-handed. They were 100% Caucasian, and the average disease duration was 8 years. And 50% of participants said that their most affected side was their right side.
So for the experimental setup, participants use a standard ballpoint pen with an electromagnetic sensor attached to the tip of the pen. The electromagnetic position collecting sensor, as seen right here in front of the piece of paper, was placed directly in front of the paper in order to maximize data collection range. And motion monitor was used to capture both EMG and kinematic activity from data collection. To collect data on muscle activity, we use 2 electromyography sensors placed on the first dorsal interosseous, or FDI, as seen on the image on the left, and extensor digitorum communis, or EDC muscle, as seen in the photo on the right. These have both been used in previous studies as muscles activated while handwriting. Participants are asked to write continuous lowercase cursive L's, as seen in the image on the bottom, on a 1.5 centimeter line paper. In order to emulate participants' natural handwriting, no instructions or example was given regarding height or width of the L. Participants were given a practice trial before each new condition that they tried, and participants were randomly assigned the order of one of the following 4 conditions: no music, which served as our control, metronome, activating music, and relaxing music. Participants were randomly assigned the order of the 4 conditions with either a standard ballpoint pen and a weighted pen with a grip. Each condition was completed 3 times for a total of 12 trials, and participants had 10 seconds to complete each trial. The subjects began listening to their designated auditory cue 5 seconds prior to beginning the writing task. A tonal beep was played in order to indicate the start of the trial, and participants were instructed to stop at the end of 10 seconds. Participants were also required to keep the pen in contact with the paper for the entire trial, and trials that did not meet these guidelines were excluded and repeated. Each participant's self-pace was calculated during their first control trial and used in the subsequent conditions, and the software pitch switch was used to accommodate each participant's self-pace during their handwriting. Self-pace was calculated by multiplying the amount of completed cursive L's written during the first 10-second control trial by 6 to calculate their L's per minute. This was then divided by 70 beats per minute to give the cadence for the relaxing music condition, and divided by 140 beats per minute for the cadence of the activating music condition. For our outcome measures, we looked at the coefficient of variation, which is the standard deviation over the average and is the relative dispersion of data points in a data set around the mean, which allows us to see the consistency changes between conditions. So for kinematic outcome measures, we looked at the average and coefficient of variation for peak-to-peak distance, letter time, and peak-to-peak time. For EMG, we looked at the average and coefficient of variation for the area under the curve for both the EDC and the FDI muscles, but these will not be included in our results section because they were found to be insignificant.
So for our results, we found that across all conditions, there was greater variability in the weighted pen than the normal pen for peak-to-peak distance, with a p-value of 0.018. Next, we found that the weighted pen was more variable than the normal pen for letter time as well, with a p-value of 0.042. Again, this was a difference between the pens and not the specific conditions. Finally, we found some interactions in our data. There's a difference between activating and control conditions, where activating was significantly less time between peaks compared to the control condition. And there was also an interaction between the control and metronome conditions for the normal pen, where the metronome had less time between peaks than the control. So the activating and metronome decreasing time between letters could be interpreted in different ways. This could mean there's less difficulty to initiate the strokes of the pen, or this could contribute to micrographia. So auditory cues, specifically metronome and activating, have effects on the time it takes to complete the series of letters. And this interpretation is what I stated previously. The weighted pen also tended to be more variable than the normal pen, which did not support our hypothesis. Specifically, this was significant for peak-to-peak distance and letter time.
Our sample size was also small, and we could not include all of our original participants in our data analysis, but the trends still offer insight to our research question. So we created a survey looking at how handwriting impacts quality of life to determine whether an intervention is practical or meaningful for this population. We're still collecting responses, and we're at about 25 right now. We're also currently writing our final research paper and intend to incorporate survey results to put everything together for our final project. These are our references, and feel free to reach out and ask questions if you're interested in our study.
All right.
Hello, we are from Dr. Stegermuller's Neurophysiology Lab, and we are presenting on the effects of auditory cues on variability in handwriting. I am Jamie Halbert.
I'm Julia Hansen. And I'm Nicole Latimer.
Literature has shown that auditory cues have been found to reduce variability in fine motor tasks.
That is good, but you don't need to go through it again. So I would encourage you, nice study there, but to reach out to Julia and Jamie and Nicole, ask them questions about the study and right within the same laboratory. With the rest of us within the same week. Kinesiology. Okay, next is Carly. And this is, Carly will be giving part of the presentation, and then part of the presentation, she'll click on a button, and it'll be pre-recorded.
Yep.
Okay. Oh, let me go get that. I have this over here.
Hello, my name is Carly. I'm a senior in kinesiology, and my faculty mentor for my project is Dr. Gillette. And my co-presenter Claire was unable to attend in person today, but hopefully in the second half of the discussion, we can play her project. So the title of our project is the effects of athletic tape on guard reaction forces and ankle joint movement during jump landing tasks. So traditional athletic tape is used to limit the range of motion around particular muscles or joints to aid in support and stability during activities. It can be used for a variety of reasons, such as reducing the risk of injury, aiding recovery, or potentially reducing pain. So my research question is to determine if there are differences in the amplitude of guard reaction forces or differences in ankle joint angles during directional jump landing tasks in ankle taped conditions versus no tape conditions. And then the results can help us then determine if athletic tape does in fact decrease the range of motion around the ankle joint, and additionally if it affects jump performance as well. And we decided to study those directional jumps because these are what commonly cause ankle injuries in the athletic settings. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the methods. So first of all, we had participants start out with just a light warm-up jog on the treadmill for about 5 minutes, and then do a standardized 10-minute warm-up consisting of some stretches, just to raise the heart rate a little bit. And then we had participants dominant ankles taped using this strategy right here, which is referred to as the closed basket weave ankle taping technique. And this is a strategy that's commonly employed by athletic trainers. For my study, I actually have a graduate student assisting with the project performing all of it, and he received his undergraduate degree in athletic training, so he has a lot of experience using this technique on athletes throughout his undergrad. And then the order of ankle taped and no taped conditions is going to be balanced across participants. So motion analysis data is collected using a 12-camera quality system in the lab that essentially captures the three-dimensional position of the participant. There's 21 total retroreflective markers placed on the participant on their dominant foot, leg, and then hips, shoulders, and back of the neck. Also to just quickly note, the system doesn't actually capture the participant itself, just those reflective markers, so no identifying information is present. So in this first picture, you can see an example of how the lab is set up for my study in particular, and I used these black arrows to point out some of our hanging cameras and then our standing cameras. So there's 12 total, either hanging or standing in this system. And then I'd also like to point out the portable force platform on the ground, as well as the force platforms that are built into the ground as well. I will talk about those in a moment that we use to measure those ground reaction forces. And then we can see in those two pictures where the markers are placed on the participant. Like I said, we have 21 total. So to talk a little bit about the jumping maneuver, it begins with the participant standing on their dominant leg in a slight squat with the knee bent. I then ask the participant if they are ready to perform the jump, and I will give them a verbal cue when it's okay to go. They will then jump at a 45-degree angle off of their dominant single leg and land either on that left or right plate, depending on which direction they're jumping from. And they'll land on that single dominant leg. And then in a continuous sort of fluid motion, they will perform a secondary jump off of the force platform straight forward and land on both feet. The jump is supposed to be performed to maximize balance of both speed and distance. So the front edge of the portable force platform is placed at 50% of the participant's height from the back edge of the one that's built into the floor, either at a 45-degree angle from the left, the right, or just straight back. And then the directions of the jumps are randomized. There'll be 3 trials for each direction, and then so that's 9 total for the angle take, and then 9 total for the no take condition, so 18 total trials are performed. And then on this slide, I have pictures of what the quality selection data looks like. In this first picture, we have the participant is standing on the portable force platform, getting ready to perform that initial jump. And then in our second picture, we have the participant landing on the one that's built into the ground, getting ready to perform that secondary jump straight forward. The system uses a model, as you can see on sort of that side of the screen there, that actually tracks and labels the markers according to the position of the body. Okay, so I currently am still in my data collection phase of this project, but some of the things that I'm hypothesizing is that decreased range of motion at the ankle joint. I'm also potentially expecting to see differences in the knee joint during landing knee flexion, and this could be due to maybe overcompensation at the knee joint because the ankle joint is restricted. I'm also hypothesizing that there may be some decreased ground reaction forces or decreased time to reach peak ground reaction force in the ankle position. This might potentially be due to the ankle having increased load within a shorter amount of time during this dynamic movement. And then the next steps in my project is to digitize the data, which essentially involves making sure that each marker is labeled correctly, that there are no extra markers, or that there are no gaps in the data as well. And then data analysis will be performed so I can determine some results and conclusions. So yeah, that's my portion of the project. And then I have Claire's video up here.
Do we want to have questions about
Yeah,
your
sure.
portion of the project first? Then we'll go on to the video.
Yeah.
Okay, any questions about Claire's project? Ankle take.
Yeah.
I have 2. So were both ankles taped or were only one ankle taped?
Just the dominant ankle was taped. And so some participants did start out with that ankle taped, and then some started out with no tape, doing the jumps first and then putting the ankle tape.
Okay, and then you said that the angle or direction of the jump was always randomized. How do you think that could influence your data? Or what is the rationale for having different angles of jumps?
Yeah, so some of the jumps, so for example, if your dominant leg is the right foot and you're jumping to the left, it's more of an awkward angle, or I would say even more difficult to perform than some of the other jumps. So the reason that we wanted to randomize it is to be sure that participants aren't starting out with a more difficult jump and finishing with the easier ones or vice versa. That was sort of the rationale.
And it was randomizing the order of positions rather than the exact angle.
Okay,
Right, yes.
Yeah, there. Other questions? So one thing that maybe say a couple more words about, I mean, when you're biomechanics, you're 355, you can volunteer, go in, take some quick data and magically get results in the Excel file. You mentioned what comes in between there, digitizing. So
Yeah.
what's involved in digitizing?
Yeah, so like I can go back and think, and so this data actually these photos are already digitized. But sometimes we have markers that the model does not pick up on and label for us. So we have to make sure we're going through and making sure that each marker is labeled appropriately. And sometimes none of them label, so we have to go through and label each 21 markers individually. And then other times while the participant is going through the jump, sometimes they become unlabeled and we have to relabel them. We have extra markers show up all the time just from other reflective materials present in the lab or on the participant's clothing. So we have to make sure that those are deleted so they're not recorded in our data. Other times there are brief gaps where maybe one of the markers gets covered up by the participant's clothing or they disappear from the data quickly. So we have to make sure that those gaps are filled. So,
Yeah. So,
anything to add to that?
yeah, when things go perfect, it's all automatic, but, you know, it's not magic. So that's kind of the part we kind of glossed over in class, but there is that work of making sure your data is all correct. Okay, so the best way to access players right through your PowerPoint?
We can try that.
Yeah, try that, otherwise we can pull it up right off.
Okay.
All right, hello everyone. I will take over from here. My name is Claire Yeager and my research is titled The Effects of Response Time on ACL Injury Risk Factors During Single Leg Hopping in Post-ACL Reconstruction Individuals. I'm majoring in kinesiology and my faculty mentor is also Dr. Jason Gillette. So a lot of athletes return to sport after an ACL tear and reconstruction, and this usually requires them to perceive and react to what's going on around them. And what I really wanted to target with my research was, do individuals with prior ACL tears and reconstructions have impaired response times in these dynamic situations? And does this impaired response time increase the risk of re-injury of the knee? So to answer this, I really needed to test two different things: response time and reaction time. Reaction time is essentially internal. It's perceiving something and then making a decision to respond. And response time includes that, but it also goes further to include actually executing that decision to respond. So let's say you're dribbling a basketball down the court and the defender suddenly pops out in front of you. Reaction time is recognizing that there's a defender in front of you and deciding what to do about it, say to cut to the left. And then response time would include everything up to that point, plus the time that it takes to actually send that motor command out to your body and actually cut to the left. Now, if an ACL injury affects neuromotor control, then the reaction time between injured subjects and controls would be the same because this is essentially cognitive. But response time, on the other hand, would be slower in previously injured individuals because the movement command going down to the limbs would be impaired. So I really needed a way to measure both of these things in my project. So to measure reaction time, the first component, I used a computer task with a series of 4 tests. And these images on the screen here are screenshots of the 4 tests. So first, on the left, was a simple reaction time task. So when the yellow circle here turned green, participants pressed the J on the keyboard as fast as possible. The remaining 3 tests were choice reaction time tests, where any of the yellow circles here could turn green, and participants had to press the corresponding key as fast as they could. And this gives a pretty good approximation of reaction time. And next, to measure response time, I had the participants perform a single leg jumping movement. 32 of these reflective markers, just like the ones that Carly described earlier, 32 were placed in specific places on the participant's body. And the cameras in our lab system, again, the same ones that Carly described earlier, these cameras recognize only the markers. So that allows us to create a model on the computer of the participant, similar to the one shown here. I also placed EMG sensors over the lateral quadriceps, lateral hamstrings, and lateral gastrocnemius muscles of each leg. And these record muscle activity as the participant jumps. So once all those markers and EMG sensors are placed, we're ready to jump. We had 2 force platforms and an arrangement very similar to the one on the image in the left here. So participants started on the first platform on one leg, and a computer screen in front of them would then cue them to jump either to the left or to the right. So basically they start on one foot on the first platform, get the signal, jump to the second force platform, and then jump to either the left or the right as signaled by the computer screen. And again, this is just measuring response time. We can measure the time from when the computer gives the signal for them to jump to when they actually activate their muscles to execute that movement using EMG and the camera system. Unfortunately, we don't have results yet, but when we compare the reaction times from the computer task and the response times from the jumping task between healthy controls and previously injured participants, we should be able to determine any differences if there are any at all. So I should have the results by the end of the month. Feel free to reach out if you're interested or check out the honors poster presentations once they're released. Here are mine and Carly's emails again, if you have any questions. And I've also, again, included the email for our faculty mentor, Dr. Gillette. That's all I have today. Thanks for everyone for listening.
Okay, so I do encourage you to contact Claire. If you have questions about her study, she was one of us who did a multiple year study, and pre-pandemic, we had all our controls, and then we were going to do our injuries, and of course we had a gap. So we have much less data on those who've already had the ACL injury. And those of you, we got lots of motor control here. You should recognize the reaction time test. We go back a long time ago, when I also taught 372. That was our fixed law that we had everybody 2, 4, 8 choices for that. Okay. So next will be Elizabeth and Sarah and Francis and Alexandra doing associations of motor competence, balance, physical activity, and obesity, and neurotypical children. I'm looking for your PowerPoint here. Let's see. Well, any hints on where it might be?
This section is 4.
4, okay.
4E, then Marlowe.
We're getting there. All right.
Okay, so the title of our research project is Associations of Motor Competence, Balance, Physical Activity, and Obesity in Neurotypical Children. So the purpose of this study is to identify the interrelationships between balance, motor skills, physical activity, and obesity. It's part of a larger study that focuses on children with autism spectrum disorder and Down syndrome. Children with autism spectrum disorder and Down syndrome experience health disparities in obesity and physical activity, as well as deficits and delays in motor skills. So as shown in the figure up top, we are testing how balance influences the relationship between motor skills and physical activity. A better understanding of these relationships will inform the design of interventions and programs that are likely to be effective in reducing these disparities. So our study consisted of 8 typically developing children between 5 and 10 years old. So to measure balance, we use the B-Track S balance tracking system score, which is similar to a lot of the force plates used in kinesiology. It measures the variability and the center of pressure of the person standing on the board, and it's connected to software that gives us a quantitative value that allows us to compare it among the children and among the other variables. We tested 3 conditions twice, and we tested, and each test was 20 seconds. Before each condition, the children got a practice trial so that they were familiar with what they were doing, and they were instructed to stand with their hands on their hips and looking forward at a focus point. The first condition was standing with 2 legs and eyes open. The second was standing with 2 legs and eyes closed. And the third was 1 leg, which is their preferred leg, with their eyes open. The results shown on the screen are only for the 2 legs and eyes closed condition because the others were either too variable or not variable enough for us to present well. The reliability of these results was poor in this portion of the study because between trial 1 and 2 that each child did, it was not consistent, and we will likely address that in the future by adding more than 2 trials. In the top right, there's a photo of the balance board with lines on it. These lines depict where the center of pressure traveled throughout one of the particular trials. And the area between these lines is what we call the ellipse area. The average ellipse area over the 8 trials, or the 8 children, is shown in the red bar in the bottom right. And the other bars are just the individual children, with the taller bars showing worse balance, and then the shorter bars show better balance. Okay, so we measured fundamental motor skills with the TTM3 test for gross motor development. It consists of 13 skills, 6 locomotor, which are like skipping and running, and then 7 ball skills like throwing and kicking. So similar to the balance protocol where we demonstrate the skill, they have a practice round, and then they have 2 real trials which are filmed, and then they're scored from the film based on the criteria for each skill. Okay, so as you can see, the reliability between trials is really high. And the gross motor index is grouped by age and sex. As you can see, our mean is 80, 81. But on the scale, 100 is the average, so our group is really underperforming. based on what we would expect for typically developing children in the US. Our next component of interest is physical activity, specifically moderate to vigorous physical activity. To measure this, participants wore an accelerometer on their wrist similar to a Fitbit or an Apple Watch that you would see. And they wore this for 7 days during waking hours. And we took the average minutes of their moderate to vigorous physical activity per day. The reliability of our results measures the consistency of the minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per day across the 7-day period that the accelerometer was worn. These results show that we have very highly active children. When looking at this figure, the red line is what the CDC recommends for children of our specific age group, which is 60 minutes per day of moderate to vigorous physical activity. And all of our children were way above that. So the next component that we measured was body composition, and we used the in-body 270 in this picture up there. And we had the participant actually take off their shoes and socks and stand on the foot markers, and the arms of the in-body will hold up, and it has the sensors as well. It actually uses current to measure the body fat percent. And we took 2 measurements of both. And the reliability was very high. It was, and it also took the weight of the child, which was 100% accurate. And the taller bars of the graph reflect like higher body fat percentages. And our mean for our children was 24.45%. And over 20% of kids is generally considered high. So over the age level that we have, they have the 5%. So the figure on the screen shows our preliminary associations between variables. And it's important to note when looking at these associations that we only had 8 children that we tested, which is a very low amount. So in the future, we would need to conduct more research with more children. So when looking at the chart, we do see that there is moderate to strong relationships between balance and both motor skills and physical activity. And both of these relationships are negative. The largest of which is between gross motor skills and balance. And this shows that more instability is associated with poor motor skills and less physical activity. So again, our conclusions are very preliminary and we can't actually make like any drastic results because it was only 8 children. And we had a group of typically developing kids with high physical activity, high body fat composition, and below average motor skills. And our balance procedure is also determined that it needs work because of the low reliability. And as Francis said, it was likely like adding the trials to that. But from the data that we did collect, there was an inverse relationship between balance and both motor skills and physical activity. And that means that poor balance is associated with lower motor skills and less physical activity.
So the next steps for this research are to apply the same procedure to a larger sample that includes children with Down syndrome and children with autism spectrum disorder, as well as the typically developing children again. This research was originally intended to focus on those children, but we weren't able to do that this spring. We do expect that this sample will show the relationships between the variables more prominently, because the children with ASD and Down syndrome tend to have delays in motor skills and balance, and they are prone to obesity and inactivity. Once we find the interrelationships between these variables from the larger sample, they may be able to be applied to interventional programs that aim to improve motor skills and balance, which in turn could lead to better body fat levels and better levels of physical activity.
We're done.
All right, my presentation. How about some questions from the crowd?
How did you find your participants?
Kind of, well, Dr. Pittsford, our sponsor, mentor, like went around his neighborhood and then that's it, like new people too.
Just local children from the area.
Yeah, they're out from here. Whoever we could find.
So we going to the schools or?
In the future, we will, for this spring, it was more just people that, we already knew and had relationships with. Just because bringing people onto campus is still complicated, so it's whoever was willing to do so.
Other questions?
I have one for you all. So out of the 4 areas of data that we collected, based on your experiences of being there and helping with the data collection, which of those 4 seems to produce the most interesting information based on what you saw and potentially key results?
I think the motor skills one is interesting because like from my experience of the kids I watched, their attention span really contributed to like just if they even wanted to try. So I think that definitely has some finding.
I agree. I think the motor skills are interesting. And like the kids who kind of have trouble like understanding like staying still on the balance board, like you can definitely see that like reflected in the motor skills. So interesting to see that as well.
I would agree on the balance aspect because there's definitely a major difference between the 5-year-olds that we had and the 10-year-olds that we had, and you could visibly see that when they were standing on the balance board that some kids just cannot stand still, but the 10-year-olds were a lot better at doing so.
Yeah, on the balance, for me, it was like, I was trying to think like, how else could you measure balance? Because like our reliability was like low, but, like that makes sense when you're physically watching them. Sometimes the kids will stand there straight, they'll do it right, and other times they'll be like, are we done yet? Like a lot of that comes with age, because like the younger they are, like, the less they do.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I'm a biomechanics nerd, so I like center of pressure analysis quite a bit. But I was going to ask you, how was the single leg standing? That was one of yours for 20 seconds. How did they do on that?
I feel like you always end up demonstrating it, to like explaining it to them a bunch of times. Because sometimes they'll get up for the first trial and they'll try to go one leg, but then we're trying to tell them it's 2 legs. And then when it's time for one leg, they are ready for 2 legs. So, but some of them do well, but a lot of them like will follow them for 10 seconds. So.
Yeah, I mean, we've done in older adults with knee replacements and things like that. Sometimes we just can't do that single leg standing. And one time we have little infants that we tried to do it, and you have them standing there, and you look up and they're gone. I understand you going.
So you had a focus point, like, did they look at a focus point?
Yeah.
Okay. So we had a smiley face posted on. Okay. Yeah.
At their eye level, but.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had something like a picture of a tiger or something. You know, trying to get something that would be interesting, but it's interesting for us.
Yeah, and I don't know if all of them looked at it. A lot of them looked at it.
Yeah.
They really like to look at that. Yeah. So.
Maybe I'm a little too entertaining.
All right, other questions? Okay, thank you. And I did something to add to the last presentation. We never sat for quarterly.
Yeah, I.
So